The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Mitchell adjusted his red uniform one final time. 23 years of service had taught him that even the smallest details mattered when protecting the royal family. His boots gleamed like mirrors, his buttons caught the early light, and his posture remained rigid despite the ache in his lower back that reminded him daily of his age. Princess Charlotte, now 8 years old, had become the light of the palace. Her laughter echoed through the grand halls, and her curious nature often led her into adventures that made the security team both proud and anxious. James had been assigned as her primary protection officer 2 years ago, and in that time, he had watched her grow from a shy 6-year-old into a confident young girl with an infectious smile and endless questions about everything around her. This particular Tuesday had started like any other. Charlotte had finished her morning lessons with her private tutor, Miss Catherine Wells, a patient woman in her 50s who had been teaching royal children for over 2 decades. The princess had excelled at her mathematics, though she struggled slightly with her French pronunciation. Miss Wells had praised her effort, which made Charlotte beam with pride as she skipped down the corridor toward the palace gardens. James followed at his usual distance, close enough to respond to any threat, but far enough to allow the princess some sense of normalcy. He knew every corner of the palace, every entrance and exit, every potential security risk. His radio crackled softly against his chest, keeping him connected to the dozen other security personnel stationed throughout the building and grounds. The gardens were Charlotte's favorite place. She loved feeding the swans in the pond, examining the different types of flowers with the head gardener, Mr. Thomas Henley, and sometimes just sitting on her favorite bench reading one of her many books. Today, she had brought The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, a story that had captured her imagination completely. As they walked through the pristine gardens, Charlotte chattered excitedly about the book's main character, Mary Lennox. She often compared herself to Mary, though James thought Charlotte was far more cheerful and optimistic than the fictional girl. The princess had a way of finding joy in the smallest things, whether it was discovering a new type of butterfly or watching the gardeners tend to the roses. The day was unusually warm for late September in London. The trees were beginning to show hints of autumn colors, and there was a gentle breeze that made the leaves dance softly overhead. Charlotte had chosen to wear her favorite blue dress with white flowers, paired with comfortable walking shoes that her mother, the Princess of Wales, had insisted upon after too many scraped knees from palace adventures. James's attention was momentarily drawn to his radio as he received an update about a scheduled maintenance check on the East Wing security cameras. The message was routine, just a confirmation that the work would begin after lunch. He acknowledged the transmission and refocused on Charlotte, who had stopped to examine a particularly large butterfly that had landed on a nearby rose bush. "Look, Captain Mitchell," Charlotte called out, using the formal title she had been taught to use, though in private moments she sometimes called him James. "It's a painted lady butterfly. Mr. Henley taught me about them last week. Did you know they migrate thousands of miles?" James smiled, his stern expression softening as it always did when Charlotte shared her discoveries. "I did not know that, Your Highness. That's quite remarkable for such a small creature." Charlotte giggled at his surprised tone. She had quickly learned that she could often teach the adults around her new things, and she took great pride in sharing her knowledge. The butterfly fluttered its wings once more before taking flight, disappearing over the tall hedge that bordered this section of the garden. They continued their walk toward Charlotte's reading spot, a secluded area near the old oak tree, where a comfortable bench had been placed specifically for her use. The location provided excellent sight lines for security while giving the princess a sense of privacy and peace. James had personally inspected the area countless times, ensuring there were no low-hanging branches that could cause injury and no hidden spots where potential threats could lurk. As they approached the bench, James noticed increased activity near the palace's main entrance. Several black vehicles had arrived, likely diplomatic visitors or government officials meeting with senior royals. This was common enough, though it always required additional coordination between different security teams. He made a mental note to check in with the command center once Charlotte was settled with her book. The princess arranged herself comfortably on the bench, smoothing her dress and opening her book to the page marked with a silk ribbon bookmark. She had a habit of reading aloud when she was particularly excited about a story, and James had grown accustomed to hearing snippets of her favorite passages. Today was no exception. as she began reading about Mary's discovery of the hidden garden key. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. Charlotte read, her voice carrying the excitement she felt for the story. No one ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather, at the ivy growing on it. James positioned himself strategically where he could observe both Charlotte and the surrounding area. His training had taught him to constantly scan for potential threats while appearing relaxed and unobtrusive. The gardens were surrounded by high walls and monitored by multiple security cameras, but he never allowed himself to become complacent. A maintenance worker appeared in the distance, pushing a wheelbarrow full of gardening supplies. James recognized him as David Price, a man who had worked on the palace grounds for 15 years. David waved casually, and James nodded in acknowledgement while noting the man's location and direction of travel. Every person on the grounds was accounted for and background checked, but vigilance remained constant. Charlotte continued reading, occasionally pausing to look up at the sky or watch a bird fly overhead. She had inherited her mother's love of nature and her father's curiosity about the world around her. The combination made her both delightful and challenging to protect, as she was always eager to explore and investigate anything that caught her attention. The morning progressed peacefully. Charlotte read several chapters while James maintained his watch, occasionally checking his radio for updates and coordinating with other security personnel. The diplomatic visitors had departed, and the palace had returned to its normal rhythm of daily activities. Around 11 o'clock, Charlotte announced that she was hungry and asked if they could return to the palace for a morning snack. This was part of her routine that had been carefully planned to ensure proper nutrition and energy levels throughout her busy days. James agreed, and they began the walk back through the gardens toward the main building. As they strolled along the gravel path, Charlotte spotted Mr. Henley near the greenhouse and asked if they could stop to see what he was working on. James assessed the request quickly, noting that the area was secure and that Henley was a trusted member of staff. He agreed, and Charlotte ran ahead excitedly, her book clutched in her small hands. Mr. Henley was replanting several small rose bushes that had been grown in the palace greenhouse. He greeted Charlotte warmly, as he always did, and began explaining the different varieties of roses and their specific care requirements. Charlotte listened intently, asking questions and even helping to pack soil around one of the smaller plants. James watched the interaction with a mixture of professional alertness and genuine warmth. These moments of normalcy were precious for Charlotte, allowing her to experience childhood joy despite the unique circumstances of her life. He had learned that protection didn't just mean preventing physical harm, but also preserving the princess's ability to grow, learn, and find happiness in everyday experiences. After spending 20 minutes with Mr. Henley, Charlotte thanked him for the lesson and promised to check on the roses' progress during their next garden visit. They resumed their walk toward the palace, Charlotte chattering about her plans to start a small garden of her own in the designated children's area near the greenhouse. As they approached the palace's side entrance, James noticed a delivery truck parked near the service area. This was scheduled and expected, as the kitchen staff received daily deliveries of fresh ingredients for the royal family's meals. However, his training required him to verify everything, so he spoke briefly into his radio to confirm that the delivery was on schedule and properly authorized. The response came back immediately. The truck was expected and had been cleared through all security protocols. The driver was a regular who had been making deliveries to the palace for several years without incident. James acknowledged the information and continued escorting Charlotte toward the entrance. Charlotte had grown quiet during the last few minutes of their walk, a sign that she was thinking deeply about something. James had learned to recognize her various moods and knew that she was probably processing something she had learned or planning her next adventure. She often approached him with questions that demonstrated remarkable intelligence and curiosity for her age. "Captain Mitchell," she said finally, as they reached the palace steps, "do you think the roses Mr. Henley planted today will still be blooming when I'm grown up?" The question touched something deep in James's heart. It spoke to Charlotte's understanding that she lived in a place with incredible history and continuity, where decisions made today would affect future generations. It also revealed her growing awareness of time and change, concepts that were becoming more real to her as she matured. "I believe they will, Your Highness," James replied thoughtfully. "Mr. Henley chooses varieties that are known for their longevity and strength. With proper care, some roses can bloom for decades. You might even bring your own children here someday to see them." Charlotte smiled at this possibility, her imagination already painting pictures of future garden visits with children of her own. She climbed the steps with renewed energy, ready for her snack and whatever adventures the rest of the day might bring. As they entered the palace through the familiar doorway, James felt the satisfaction that came from another successful morning of protection duty. Charlotte was safe, happy, and continuing to grow into the remarkable young woman she was destined to become. The morning had been routine, peaceful, and exactly the kind of day that both he and the princess treasured. Little did either of them know that in just a few hours, their lives would change forever in a moment that would test every aspect of James's training, dedication, and love for the little girl he had sworn to protect. The afternoon would bring challenges neither of them could imagine, and James's 23 years of experience will be put to the ultimate test in ways he had never anticipated. For now, though, Charlotte was safe, heading toward the palace kitchen for her favorite morning snack of fresh berries and cream, completely unaware of the dramatic events that awaited them both in the hours to come. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the palace's east wing as Princess Charlotte finished her lunch in the family dining room. She had enjoyed her favorite meal of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread, followed by strawberries and cream for dessert. Her afternoon schedule included a music lesson with Professor Elena Rossetti, followed by some free time before dinner with her parents. James Mitchell had been monitoring palace communications during lunch, staying informed about the day's activities while maintaining his protective watch over Charlotte. The delivery truck he had noted earlier had completed its service and departed without incident. All security checkpoints reported normal status, and the diplomatic visit from the morning had concluded successfully. Charlotte's music teacher had arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, as was her custom. Professor Rossetti was an elegant woman in her early 60s who had taught piano to 3 generations of the royal family. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had performed on the world's greatest stages before dedicating her later career to education. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, and she wore flowing dresses that seemed to move with the rhythm of her music. The music room was located on the 2nd floor of the palace, chosen specifically for its excellent acoustics and beautiful grand piano that had been a gift from the Austrian government decades earlier. Large windows overlooked the gardens where Charlotte and James had spent their morning, providing natural light that made the room feel warm and inviting. Charlotte had been taking piano lessons for 2 years and showed genuine talent and enthusiasm for music. She particularly enjoyed classical pieces, but had recently begun expressing interest in contemporary music that she heard on the radio. Professor Rossetti was skilled at balancing proper musical education with Charlotte's natural curiosity and desire to explore different styles. Today's lesson focused on a simplified version of Chopin's Minute Waltz, a piece that challenged Charlotte's developing technique while remaining within her capabilities. She sat at the piano with perfect posture, her small fingers finding the keys with increasing confidence. The familiar melody filled the room as she played through the sections she had practiced since their last lesson. James positioned himself near the room's entrance where he could observe both Charlotte and monitor the corridor outside. The music room was one of his favorite assignment locations because it provided excellent sight lines and only had one entrance to secure. The windows were too high to present any external threat, and the room's acoustics meant he could easily hear any changes in Charlotte's normal activities. "Excellent work on the left hand, Princess," Professor Rossetti encouraged, her slight Italian accent adding warmth to her words. "Now let's focus on keeping the rhythm steady in measures 12 through 16. Remember, the left hand provides the foundation for the entire piece." Charlotte nodded seriously, appreciating detailed instruction that helped her improve. She approached her music lessons with the same curiosity and determination she brought to everything else, whether it was learning about butterflies or helping to plant roses. Her concentration was intense as she worked through the challenging passage repeatedly until she achieved the smooth, flowing rhythm Professor Rossetti demonstrated. Through the windows, James could see palace staff going about their daily routines in the gardens below. The head gardener was directing 2 assistants in preparing flower beds for autumn planting. Security personnel made their regular patrols along designated routes. Everything appeared normal and peaceful, exactly as it should be during a typical afternoon at the palace. Charlotte's lesson progressed well, with Professor Rossetti introducing some new concepts about musical phrasing and expression. The princess was particularly interested in how different touches on the keys could create various moods and emotions in music. She experimented with playing the same passage softly and then with more force, listening carefully to how the changes affected the overall sound. Music is like telling a story, Professor Rossetti explained, her hands dancing gracefully over the keys as she demonstrated. Each note is a word, each phrase is a sentence, and each piece tells us something about the composer's feelings and experiences. When you play, you become the storyteller. This concept fascinated Charlotte, who loved reading stories and was beginning to understand how music could convey emotions in ways similar to books. She asked thoughtful questions about how composers decided which notes to use and how musicians interpreted pieces differently. Professor Rossetti was delighted by her students' intellectual engagement with the music. James checked his watch and noted that the lesson was proceeding on schedule. Charlotte's afternoon free time would begin at 3:30, and he knew she was planning to return to the gardens to finish reading her book. The weather remained perfect for outdoor activities, with gentle breezes and warm sunshine that would make for pleasant reading conditions. At exactly 3:15, Professor Rossetti began concluding the lesson by having Charlotte play through the entire Chopin piece one final time. The princess's performance showed marked improvement from the beginning of the lesson, and her teacher praised her dedication and progress. They discussed practice goals for the week ahead, with Professor Rossetti assigning specific exercises to strengthen Charlotte's finger independence. "You have natural musical instincts, princess," the teacher said as she packed her sheet music. "Continue practicing the scales we worked on today, and I believe you'll be ready to begin learning Mozart next week. He wrote some beautiful pieces that I think you'll enjoy very much." Charlotte beamed with pride at the prospect of learning Mozart, a composer she had heard her parents discuss during their own musical conversations. She thanked Professor Rossetti politely and walked her to the door, displaying the gracious manners that had been carefully instilled in her from an early age. After the teacher's departure, Charlotte requested permission to return to her reading spot in the gardens. James assessed the security situation quickly, noting that all systems remained normal and that the outdoor conditions were ideal for the princess's afternoon activity. He agreed to escort her back to the bench by the old oak tree where she had been reading earlier. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the garden entrance, Charlotte chatted excitedly about her music lesson and her plans for practice during the coming week. She had developed a genuine love for piano that went beyond mere obligation, and James enjoyed listening to her enthusiasm. Her passion for learning reminded him daily why his protective mission was so important and meaningful. The corridors of the palace were quieter now than they had been during the morning's activities. Most official business had concluded for the day, and the building had settled into its afternoon rhythm. Staff members went about their duties efficiently and quietly, maintaining the environment of dignified calm that characterized the royal residence. Charlotte's book was still waiting on the garden bench where she had left it, bookmark carefully placed to mark her progress through the secret garden. The afternoon light was perfect for reading, filtered through the oak tree's leaves to provide comfortable illumination without glare. A gentle breeze stirred the pages slightly as Charlotte settled herself comfortably and picked up where she had left off. James took his customary position where he could observe both the princess and the surrounding area. The gardens appeared exactly as they had in the morning, with staff members continuing their various maintenance and preparation activities. The roses Mr. Henley had planted were already settling into their new locations, and Charlotte waved to him when she spotted him working near the greenhouse. The afternoon was peaceful and routine, everything proceeding exactly as planned and expected. Charlotte read contentedly, while James maintained his vigilant watch, both of them enjoying the calm beauty of the palace gardens on a perfect early autumn day. Neither of them had any indication that this tranquility was about to be shattered by events beyond anyone's control. At approximately 4:15, James received a routine radio transmission about a scheduled maintenance vehicle that would be arriving at the palace's service entrance. The message indicated that a contracted company would be performing annual inspections on the building's fire safety systems, work that had been planned for months and properly cleared through all security protocols. James acknowledged the transmission and made a mental note of the scheduled activity. The service entrance was on the opposite side of the palace from their current location, and the maintenance work would not affect Charlotte's afternoon reading time or their planned return route to the main building. Everything remained on schedule and according to plan. Charlotte had become absorbed in her book, reading about Mary Lennox's growing friendship with Dickon and their shared efforts to restore the secret garden. She occasionally read interesting passages aloud, sharing her excitement about the story's developments. Her voice carried genuine emotion as she described the characters' discoveries and adventures. The maintenance vehicle arrived at the service entrance precisely on schedule, a white van marked with the logo of British Fire Safety Services, a company that had been providing services to government buildings for over a decade. The driver presented proper identification and documentation to security personnel, who verified the information against their scheduled appointment database. Everything appeared normal and routine as the vehicle was cleared to enter the service area and park near the designated maintenance entrance. The driver and his assistant began unloading their equipment, preparing to conduct their inspections according to the predetermined schedule that would take them through various areas of the palace over the next several hours. James continued his protection duties, monitoring radio communications and observing the peaceful garden environment where Charlotte was enjoying her book. The afternoon sun was beginning its gradual descent, casting longer shadows across the lawn and creating the beautiful golden light that made the gardens particularly magical during this time of day. Charlotte looked up from her reading and announced that she had reached a particularly exciting part of the story where the secret garden was beginning to show signs of new life after years of neglect. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she described how the characters were working together to bring beauty back to the forgotten place. The parallel between the fictional garden and the real palace gardens around her was not lost on the intelligent young princess. At 4:45, James received another routine radio transmission confirming that the maintenance team had completed their initial equipment setup and was beginning their systematic inspection of the building's fire safety systems. The work was proceeding according to schedule, with no complications or unusual circumstances reported. All other palace security systems continued to show normal status across all monitored areas. The peaceful afternoon continued exactly as planned, with Charlotte absorbed in her reading and James maintaining his professional watch over her safety. The gardens remained tranquil and beautiful, filled with the gentle sounds of nature and the distant activities of palace staff going about their daily routines. Everything seemed perfect and secure. Unknown to either Charlotte or James, the maintenance vehicle that had arrived so punctually and with such proper documentation contained something far more dangerous than fire safety inspection equipment. The careful planning and legitimate credentials had been part of an elaborate deception that was about to unfold in ways that would challenge every aspect of James's training and dedication. The next few hours would transform a routine afternoon into a test of courage, loyalty, and split-second decision-making that would change both Charlotte and James forever. But for now, in these final moments of peace, they remained unaware of the approaching danger, enjoying the simple pleasure of a beautiful autumn afternoon in the safety of the palace gardens. At exactly 5 o'clock, James Mitchell's radio crackled with a transmission that would change everything. The voice of Commander Sarah Williams, head of palace security, came through with unusual urgency that immediately caught his attention. Her normally calm and controlled tone carried an edge of concern that set off every alarm in James's experienced mind. All units, we have a developing situation. Maintenance personnel have been found unconscious in the service basement. The individuals currently in the building are not authorized. Repeat, we have unknown subjects in the palace. All protection details maintain current positions and await further instructions. James felt his heart rate spike as the implications of the message became clear. The maintenance team that had arrived with proper credentials and documentation had somehow been replaced by imposters who now had access to the palace's interior systems. His 23 years of training kicked in immediately, and he began assessing his tactical situation while keeping his expression calm to avoid alarming Princess Charlotte. Charlotte continued reading, completely unaware of the dramatic change in their circumstances. She was absorbed in a particularly exciting chapter of The Secret Garden and had not noticed the subtle shift in James's posture and alertness level. This was exactly what he wanted, to maintain her sense of safety and normalcy while he evaluated their options and prepared for whatever might come next. James spoke quietly into his radio, acknowledging the transmission and requesting additional information about the threat level and recommended response procedures. He positioned himself to have clear sightlines of all approaches to their garden location, while appearing to maintain his normal protective stance. His hand moved instinctively closer to his concealed service weapon, though he hoped desperately that he would not need to use it. The response from Commander Williams provided more disturbing details. The real maintenance workers had been discovered bound and unconscious in a van parked several blocks from the palace. They were alive, but had been drugged and would require medical attention. The imposters had used sophisticated false identification and had intimate knowledge of the palace's security procedures, suggesting careful planning and inside information. More troubling still was the news that the imposters had disappeared somewhere within the palace's vast network of corridors and service areas. Security cameras had tracked them through the service entrance and into the lower levels, but they had then moved into areas with limited surveillance coverage. Teams were being deployed to search the building systematically, but the process would take time. James quickly calculated distances and routes in his mind. Their current position in the gardens provided both advantages and disadvantages. They were isolated from the immediate threat, but they were also far from the main security center and backup support. The garden's high walls offered protection from external threats, but the multiple pathways and entrance points could potentially provide access for determined intruders. Charlotte looked up from her book and noticed James speaking into his radio more frequently than usual. Her intelligent eyes showed curiosity rather than concern, and she asked if everything was all right. James made the crucial decision to maintain normalcy while beginning subtle preparations for a possible emergency relocation. "Everything is fine, Your Highness," he said in his most reassuring voice. "The security team is just coordinating some routine activities. How is your book progressing?" Charlotte accepted his explanation and returned her attention to reading, though James noticed she glanced at him once or twice with the perceptive awareness that made her such a remarkable child. She sensed that something had changed, even if she couldn't identify exactly what it was. Her intuitive intelligence was one of the things that made protecting her both easier and more challenging. James received another radio transmission indicating that the search teams had found evidence of the imposters' presence in the palace's lower levels. Tools and equipment had been discovered that were definitely not related to fire safety inspections. More ominously, the items suggested possible intentions to access the building's main electrical or communication systems, though the exact purpose remained unclear. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the garden as James evaluated their tactical options. He could request immediate extraction to the main security center, but moving Charlotte through potentially compromised areas of the palace could expose her to greater risk than keeping her in their current secure location. The garden position provided excellent visibility and multiple escape routes if necessary. Commander Williams' voice came through the radio again with an update that made James's blood run cold. The imposters had been tracked to the palace's main level, somewhere in the east wing not far from the gardens. Their intentions remained unknown, but their movement pattern suggested they were searching for something or someone specific. All protection details were ordered to maintain high alert status and prepare for possible emergency procedures. Charlotte sensed the change in atmosphere around her protector and looked up with growing concern. She had learned to read the adults around her with remarkable accuracy, and James's increased tension was becoming difficult to hide. Her question came with the directness that characterized her approach to everything that puzzled her. "Captain Mitchell, is something wrong? You seem worried about something." James made a decision that would prove crucial in the events that followed. Rather than continuing to hide the situation completely, he chose to tell Charlotte enough truth to ensure her cooperation without causing panic. His years of experience had taught him that children often responded better to honest information than to deceptive reassurances. "Princess, there are some visitors in the palace who shouldn't be here," he said carefully, kneeling beside her bench to speak at her eye level. "The security team is handling the situation, but I need you to listen very carefully to everything I tell you and do exactly as I say. Can you do that for me?" Charlotte's expression grew serious as she processed this information. Despite her young age, she understood that her safety sometimes required following instructions without question. She had been taught about security procedures since she was very small, and she knew that Captain Mitchell would never unnecessarily frighten her. "Yes, Captain Mitchell," she replied with remarkable composure. "I understand. What do you need me to do?" James felt a surge of pride in her mature response, even as he continued monitoring his radio for updates. Charlotte carefully marked her place in her book and prepared to follow his instructions, demonstrating the presence of mind and cooperation that would prove essential in the challenging minutes ahead. The radio transmitted another urgent message that changed everything. One of the palace security cameras had captured clear images of the imposters, and facial recognition software had identified them as members of a radical group with previous convictions for attempted kidnapping and assault. The threat level was upgraded to maximum, and all protection details were authorized to use any means necessary to ensure the safety of family members. James felt the weight of 23 years of training and experience crystallize into this single moment of decision. He had sworn an oath to protect Princess Charlotte with his life, if necessary, and that moment might have arrived sooner than anyone had anticipated. His mind raced through tactical options while his body prepared for action. Charlotte watched his face carefully and seemed to understand that their situation had become more serious. She remained calm and alert, waiting for his instructions with the trust that had developed between them over 2 years of daily interaction. Her confidence in his ability to protect her was both inspiring and sobering for James as he prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The peaceful garden that had been their sanctuary throughout the morning and afternoon now felt exposed and vulnerable. James's eyes swept constantly across the multiple pathways and entrance points, searching for any sign of movement or threat. His radio remained active with updates from the search teams, but the imposters had apparently gone to ground somewhere within the palace's vast interior. At 5:20, James received a transmission that made his decision for him. Security cameras had spotted one of the imposters near the east wing entrance to the gardens, apparently attempting to locate a way outside. The individual was moving purposefully toward their general area, though it was unclear whether he knew of Charlotte's specific location. James helped Charlotte to her feet and explained that they needed to move to a more secure location immediately. She gathered her book without question and prepared to follow his lead, demonstrating the maturity and courage that would soon be put to an even greater test. Together, they began moving toward what James hoped would be safety, unaware that their greatest challenge was still ahead. The imposter had spotted them through the garden foliage and was now moving to intercept their path. James's radio crackled with warnings, but he was already in motion, his body positioned between Charlotte and the approaching threat. The peaceful afternoon had transformed into a life-or-death situation that would demand every ounce of his skill, courage, and dedication. Charlotte looked up at James with complete trust, not yet understanding the full magnitude of the danger they faced, but knowing that her protector would do everything in his power to keep her safe. The collision of events that would define both of their lives was now only moments away, rushing toward them with unstoppable momentum through the beautiful gardens that had been their peaceful refuge such a short time ago. The collision happened in slow motion, yet faster than James Mitchell could have ever prepared for. As he guided Princess Charlotte along the garden path toward what he hoped would be safety, a figure emerged from behind the large rhododendron bushes that bordered the walking area. The man was tall, wearing dark clothing that didn't match the maintenance uniform he should have been wearing, and his movements had the purposeful intensity of someone with dangerous intentions. James's training took over instantly. In one fluid motion, he pushed Charlotte behind him while simultaneously reaching for his radio and weapon. But the imposter was closer than expected and moving with desperate speed. He lunged forward, apparently trying to reach Charlotte before James could fully position himself as a barrier between them. "Stay back," James shouted, his voice carrying the authority of someone prepared to use deadly force to protect his charge. But the imposter either didn't hear or chose to ignore the warning, continuing his forward momentum toward the princess. What happened next would replay in James's mind for the rest of his life. The imposter's foot caught on an uneven section of the garden path, causing him to stumble and change direction slightly. Instead of reaching Charlotte as he had apparently intended, he collided directly with James, who had positioned himself exactly where his training and instincts had dictated. The impact was tremendous. Two adult men moving at full speed crashed together with bone-jarring force. James felt the collision through every part of his body as they went down together, rolling across the gravel path in a tangle of arms and legs. His radio went flying, clattering against the base of a nearby tree. His weapon remained secure in its holster, but his arm was trapped beneath the imposter's weight. Charlotte screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through James's consciousness like a knife. He had never heard her make such a sound before, and it filled him with desperate urgency to end this situation immediately. She had stumbled backward when James pushed her to safety, and now she stood frozen several feet away, clutching her book against her chest like a shield. James fought to get his bearings as he wrestled with the imposter on the gravel path. The man was strong and desperate, fighting with the intensity of someone who knew that capture meant a return to prison. James's 23 years of training and experience gave him advantages in technique and strategy, but the imposter's desperation made him dangerous and unpredictable. "Run, princess!" James gasped between attempts to gain control of the situation. "Run to the palace. Find help." But Charlotte seemed frozen by the violence unfolding before her. She had never witnessed anything like this before, and her young mind was struggling to process what was happening to the man who had been her protector and friend for 2 years. Her legs seemed unable to obey James's urgent command to flee to safety. The imposter managed to break partially free from James's grip and reached towards Charlotte with desperate fingers. "Come here, girl," he snarled, his voice harsh and frightening. "You're coming with me." The threat to Charlotte released a surge of protective fury in James that gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He grabbed the imposter's extended arm and used his leverage to slam the man back against the gravel path. The impact drove the air from the imposter's lungs and gave James the opportunity he needed to gain a decisive advantage in their struggle. James managed to get one knee on the imposter's chest while maintaining control of his arms. The man continued to struggle, but James's position and training allowed him to gradually gain complete control of the situation. His breath came in harsh gasps as adrenaline and physical exertion took their toll, but his focus remained entirely on neutralizing the threat to Charlotte. "You're too late anyway," the imposter gasped, his eyes wild with a mixture of rage and desperation. "The others are already in position. This was just a distraction." The words sent ice through James's veins. If this confrontation had been a distraction, what was the real objective? Where were the other imposters, and what were they planning? He needed to get Charlotte to safety immediately and alert the security team about this new information. Charlotte finally found her voice and began calling for help, her clear young voice carrying across the gardens. "Help! Help us! Someone help Captain Mitchell!" Her cries would bring assistance, but James didn't know how long it would take for backup to arrive or what other threats might emerge before then. James managed to secure his radio, which had landed within arm's reach when it flew from his hand during the collision. With one hand maintaining control of the imposter, he activated the emergency frequency and transmitted a priority alert to the command center. "Command, this is Mitchell. I have engaged one suspect in the East Gardens. Princess is secure, but we need immediate backup. Suspect indicates this was a distraction for other activities. Request full threat assessment and extraction support." Commander Williams' response came immediately, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Backup en route, ETA 2 minutes. We have reports of additional suspicious activity in the main building. Maintain position and protect the princess until support arrives." James looked at Charlotte, who was now standing a safe distance away, but still within his sight. Her face was pale with shock, but she appeared physically unharmed. The book she had been reading lay forgotten on the path where she had dropped it during the confrontation. Her eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but she was following his instructions to stay back while remaining close enough for him to protect her. The imposter beneath him had stopped struggling, apparently realizing that escape was impossible. But his earlier words about other activities continued to worry James intensely. What had been the real purpose of this infiltration? Was Charlotte still in danger from threats he couldn't see or anticipate? In the distance, James could hear the sound of running footsteps and shouted commands as backup security teams responded to his emergency call. The cavalry was coming, but these few minutes of isolation and vulnerability felt like hours as he maintained control of the immediate threat while scanning the surrounding area for additional dangers. Charlotte's voice was small and shaky when she spoke. "Captain Mitchell, are you hurt? Is the bad man going to hurt us?" "I'm fine, Princess," James replied, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring despite his own elevated stress levels. "The bad man can't hurt you. Help is coming, and everything is going to be all right." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, James's mind was racing through tactical scenarios and potential threats. The imposter's revelation about a distraction suggested careful planning and coordination. The security breach was more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had initially realized. The first backup officers arrived at a run, their weapons drawn, and their movements coordinated and professional. They quickly secured the imposter and established a protective perimeter around James and Charlotte. Within minutes, the immediate danger had passed, but the larger implications of the security breach were just beginning to unfold. Commander Williams arrived moments later, her expression grim as she assessed the situation. She spoke briefly with James to confirm that both he and Charlotte were unharmed, then began coordinating the response to what was clearly a more complex threat than anyone had anticipated. Charlotte was led away from the scene by female officers trained in working with children, but she kept looking back at James with concerned eyes. The trauma of witnessing violence would require careful attention and support, but her physical safety had been preserved through James's quick thinking and decisive action. As medical personnel checked James for injuries from the collision and struggle, he reflected on how quickly their peaceful afternoon had transformed into a life-threatening crisis. His body ached from the physical confrontation, but his spirit was lifted by the knowledge that Charlotte was safe and that his training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. The imposter was taken into custody and would face serious charges for his attempted assault on a member of the royal family. But his cryptic comments about the incident being a distraction would launch an intensive investigation into the full scope of the security breach and the identity of his accomplices. James had acted instantly to protect Princess Charlotte, and his swift response had prevented what could have been a tragic outcome. But the events in the garden were only the beginning of a larger story that would have profound implications for palace security and the safety of the royal family. The collision that changed everything had been successfully navigated, but the aftermath would reveal challenges and changes that no one could have anticipated. Charlotte's trust in her protector had been validated in the most dramatic way possible, and their relationship would be forever strengthened by the crisis they had faced together. But the trauma of the experience would also mark the end of her childhood innocence and the beginning of a more complex understanding of the dangers that surrounded her privileged but vulnerable position. The peaceful gardens would eventually return to their tranquil beauty, but neither Charlotte nor James would ever see them in quite the same way again. The collision had protected her from immediate harm, but it had also collided with their previous sense of security and normalcy in ways that would reshape their lives in the months and years to come. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the palace gardens, and life was slowly returning to a new version of normal for both Princess Charlotte and Captain James Mitchell. The investigation into the security breach had revealed the full extent of the threat they had faced that afternoon, information that made James even more grateful for the split-second decisions that had kept Charlotte safe. The imposter he had subdued was part of a 4-person team that had planned an elaborate kidnapping scheme. Their research into palace routines had been extensive and sophisticated, involving months of surveillance and insider information obtained through coercion of a former palace employee. The maintenance company infiltration had been designed to give them access to the building's layout and security systems while providing cover for their presence on the grounds. Charlotte's afternoon reading routine had been specifically targeted because it represented a predictable time and location where she would be relatively isolated with minimal security presence. The collision in the garden had disrupted their carefully planned timeline and given palace security the opportunity to locate and apprehend the other team members before they could implement their escape plan. James had been commended by his superiors and recommended for recognition by the royal family themselves, but the praise felt hollow compared to the simple knowledge that Charlotte was safe and beginning to heal from the trauma of that frightening afternoon. He had sustained minor injuries during his struggle with the imposter, including bruised ribs and a sprained wrist, but these physical reminders of the confrontation were fading more quickly than the emotional impact. Charlotte had handled the aftermath of the incident with remarkable resilience, though she had experienced nightmares and periods of anxiety that required careful attention for palace counselors and her family. Her parents had been profoundly grateful to James for his protection of their daughter, and their personal thanks had meant more to him than any official commendation could have provided. The princess had returned to her regular routine of lessons and activities, but with enhanced security measures that reflected the new understanding of potential threats to her safety. Additional protection officers had been assigned to her detail, and her movements were now more carefully coordinated and monitored. The innocent freedom she had previously enjoyed was necessarily curtailed, a loss that saddened everyone involved in her care. James had been offered the opportunity to transfer to less demanding duties after 23 years of service, but he had requested to remain as Charlotte's primary protection officer. The events in the garden had only strengthened his commitment to her safety and his understanding of how crucial his role had become. She needed continuity and familiar faces as she processed her experience and moved forward. Their relationship had evolved in the weeks following the incident. Charlotte now understood in a very concrete way that James was prepared to risk his life to protect her, and this knowledge had deepened her respect and affection for her guardian. She was more attentive to his instructions and more aware of the security considerations that shaped her daily activities. James found himself even more protective of Charlotte's remaining opportunities for normal childhood experiences. He advocated within the security team for maintaining as much of her previous freedom as possible while implementing necessary safety enhancements. His intimate knowledge of her personality and needs made him an effective voice for balancing security with her emotional and developmental requirements. The gardens have been thoroughly reviewed and enhanced with additional security measures, but Charlotte had asked to continue her afternoon reading time in the same location. Her insistence on returning to the scene of the trauma demonstrated remarkable courage and a refusal to allow fear to dictate her choices. James supported her decision while ensuring that the enhanced security measures would prevent any similar incidents. On this particular afternoon, Charlotte was reading a new book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, a story that captured her imagination with its themes of courage, loyalty, and the triumph of good over evil. The parallels to her recent experience were not lost on her, and she occasionally shared observations about the character's bravery with James. The additional security presence was subtle but comprehensive. James was no longer alone in protecting Charlotte during her garden visits. 2 additional officers maintained discreet positions that provided overlapping coverage while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. Communication systems had been upgraded, and emergency response procedures had been refined based on lessons learned from the incident. Professor Elena Rossetti had resumed Charlotte's piano lessons with some modifications to account for the enhanced security requirements. The music room activities continued on schedule, but with additional coordination between security teams and alternative locations identified in case of any future emergencies. Charlotte's musical progress had actually accelerated in the weeks following the incident, as she found comfort and emotional expression through her piano practice. The prince and princess had met privately with James to express their personal gratitude and to discuss Charlotte's ongoing security needs. They had been deeply moved by his willingness to put himself in harm's way to protect their daughter, and they had made it clear that they considered him not just an employee, but a trusted friend of the family. This recognition meant everything to James and reinforced his commitment to his protective mission. Charlotte's therapist had worked with her to process the emotions and memories associated with the garden incident. The princess had shown remarkable maturity in discussing her fears and reactions, and she had developed coping strategies that would serve her well in dealing with future stress or anxiety. Her recovery had been faster and more complete than many adults might have achieved under similar circumstances. The investigation had led to the arrest and prosecution of all 4 conspirators, along with several associates who had provided support and information for their scheme. The legal proceedings would continue for months, but the immediate threat to Charlotte's safety had been eliminated. The case had also led to comprehensive reviews of security procedures at all royal residences. James had used his own experience to contribute to training programs for other protection officers, sharing tactical insights and decision-making processes that could benefit future security operations. His willingness to collide with the threat rather than attempting to avoid confrontation had become a case study in decisive protective action under pressure. Charlotte often asked James about his career and his experiences protecting her family. She had developed a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices and commitments required of those who dedicated their lives to serving others. These conversations had contributed to her growing understanding of duty, service, and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The oak tree bench remained Charlotte's favorite reading spot, though she now shared it with enhanced security presence and modified routines. She had insisted on retrieving her copy of The Secret Garden from the path where it had fallen during the incident, and she had finished reading it as a symbol of not allowing fear to interrupt her normal activities and interests. James watched Charlotte read her new book with a mixture of professional vigilance and personal affection. The little girl who had trusted him completely during their terrifying ordeal had grown visibly more mature and thoughtful in the weeks since. She retained her natural curiosity and joy, but these qualities were now tempered with an awareness of the world's complexities that few children her age possessed. The afternoon sun cast familiar patterns of light and shadow through the oak tree's leaves, creating the same beautiful environment that had been the scene of such drama just 3 weeks earlier. The peaceful setting had been restored, but both Charlotte and James carried within themselves the permanent changes that resulted from facing danger together and emerging safely through courage, training, and devotion to duty. Charlotte looked up from her book and smiled at James with a special warmth reserved for someone who had proven himself worthy of complete trust. "Captain Mitchell," she said softly, "thank you for keeping me safe. I know it wasn't easy, and I'm grateful that you were there with me." James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he replied, "It was my honor, Princess. Protecting you is the most important thing I will ever do, and I would do it again without hesitation." The simple exchange captured the depth of their relationship and the transformation they had both undergone. The collision that had threatened to destroy their peaceful afternoon had instead forged an unbreakable bond between protector and protected, guardian and child, friend and friend. As Charlotte returned to her reading and James resumed his watchful vigilance, both of them understood that their lives had been permanently changed by those few moments of violence and courage in the beautiful palace gardens. They had faced the ultimate test together and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed to each other than ever before. The gardens remained as beautiful as ever. The late afternoon light continued to filter through ancient oak leaves, and Princess Charlotte continued to grow and learn under the protective watch of the man who had acted instantly when her safety was threatened. Their story would continue with enhanced security and deeper understanding, but the foundation of trust and devotion established during their moment of crisis would endure for all the years to come.